Tim Wilson, thanks for talking to us today.
A pleasure.
Can I ask you, as a former policy director at the IPA, your appointment to the Australian Human Rights Commission attracted a modicum of controversy. Can you tell us what your approach to the job will be and your underlying philosophy and motivation?
Well, human rights belong to everybody. They're a political construct that exists, and people have different attitudes, and I've made it quite clear what my attitude and approach is going to be. I view human rights very much from what I would argue is its traditional principles and its traditional values and what I would call a classical liberal approach to human rights. And in response to that, some people obviously have different views, and that's why in part my appointment was controversial, and I'm not hiding away from that. But I think that's a really important basis to inject conversation back into human rights, because my criticism of discussion around human rights is that they've gone from being sacrosanct principles about the dignity of the individual and their right to live their lives away from government interference and telling people prescriptively what they can do, and the sense of ownership they have over their own lives, towards otherwise important, worthy social aspirations about the type of just society that we want. And of course, when you elevate those things to rights, when they become much more inconsistent, and when so many things get elevated to the status of rights, you naturally weaken the integrity of human rights from the outset. So what I've said is I want to return and focus back on what I would call traditional classical liberal human rights around freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement, religious worship, and of course other important human rights like the first one, which is freedom from arbitrary detention. And that of course brings a lot of issues to the fore and shouldn't be compromised in discussing public policy in Australia.
Are there any concrete specific things you have set yourself to achieve during your tenure as Human Rights Commissioner?
Well, there's two parts to my role as Human Rights Commissioner. Obviously, I am the Human Rights Commissioner for Australia, but equally there has never been somebody who has been openly gay and been in the position of Human Rights Commissioner. And so I carry the portfolio that is always fit between everybody else's portfolios, because there are 8 commissioners in total focusing on different areas of discrimination and policy around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex affairs. So I'm the full-time Human Rights Commissioner and the full-time de facto LGBTI Commissioner. And so there are specific things I want to do in that. And where I might perhaps have a different view on some aspects of human rights, it's mostly around where the law sits and the role of the law. But it doesn't take away from common aspirations about having a more just society and how we want to achieve them. And the classic example is in the LGBTI space, where there's a lot of work I want to do in promoting cultural change and change in attitudes towards people from different sexual orientations and the issues around gender diversity and identity. So there's that component of it. In the human rights space, I think a lot of it's coming out of a process of exploring with the Australian public where they see the issues are. Every new commissioner who comes into the job goes through a process of engagement and consultation and taking feedback. And sometimes things you end up seeking to do are based on what you learn and listen from others. And because I am very keen to listen to other people, I'm going to be creating a sort of listening tour, as it were, to engage with people and get their ideas.
So is Australia well served by its human rights infrastructure? Do we need enshrined protection through a Bill of Rights or explicit provisions in the Constitution?
I've maintained my view as open on this discussion because I understand both sides of the debate, as it were, between whether we should have constitutional, legislative protections or no protections at all. And it's a lively debate for good reasons, because part of it is how you see human rights, about whether you see them as sort of culturally infused norms that go through our political system, or whether they're something that Parliament gives us, or whether there's something that is protected by the courts. And of course, there are unintended consequences of all of the different avenues. So I've said my position's open, it remains open. I guess my instinct is always against change rather than for change in this space. But I have had convincing arguments put to me recently, and I guess this is one of the things I'm looking forward to listening and hearing about the arguments in this listening tour that will be happening.
Do you think Australians are a so-called active citizenry who take a strong interest in their rights and responsibilities and the potential for governments to abuse their powers?
I think Australia has the potential to be a country of active citizens defending their rights, but also acknowledging the responsibilities that come with defending those rights. And I think part of the challenge is human rights have become increasingly disconnected from the philosophical principles and foundations of our free society. They've become disconnected from people's priorities. And so you see this all the time where people say, I have a right to this and I have a right to that. Well, human rights are actually, in an intellectual sense, much more narrow, and I've already outlined some of them already, because they're universal principles that we can all exercise, and we can all exercise reasonably consistently. A lot of people also conflate things that are civil rights, which are gifts from society and gifts of citizenship, with human rights, which in a sort of a broader term are supposed to be about what you get as your natural birthright as a person, regardless of where you live or not. And so I think there's a potential, but I think people need to get back to the idea of what human rights are and then recognise how much those rights are important for their sense of individual dignity and importance of themselves and control and ownership of their own lives, but then taking it forward and recognising the responsibilities that come with that.
So I guess the obverse of the question I just put to you is, do governments in Australia have a tendency to impinge on personal liberties or human rights?
I think it's undoubted that Australia has governments that do impinge on human rights. It's a question of whether they're aware of it and whether they do it rightly, and that's part of the challenge of being Human Rights Commissioner. Now, I only get to focus on federal law. I'd love every aspect of law in the country, though I'd probably be a little too busy to do all of that. But I think there's an acknowledgement that human rights are very important as much as we seek to then go out and achieve other social aspirations, to promote more harmony and to remove prejudice and to deal with some of the more complex issues that exist in our society. Sometimes rights can be trampled on. And the question really in that situation isn't, are we doing it? It's, do we know we're doing it? And then is it justified why we're doing it? And that's part of the discussion. So I think there needs to be a greater awareness of the role of rights, how important they are, and then to go from that and recognise that when you're developing law.
Coming from our sector, is there a need for people who are newly arrived to Australia, many who may have come from nations, without traditions of freedom and liberty, to be educated about their rights and responsibilities, here?
I think it's undoubted that people who come to this country from different backgrounds where different social norms and different cultural practices have informed how their societies govern themselves, that there does need to be discussion and education about rights and responsibilities, because Australia is in a unique political country and culturally, politically, socially, in that we are obviously a comparatively new nation in its modern form, and that we're a fusion of great political traditions, of tried and tested methods of the British and particularly the American political systems, and how we have designed our democracy. And that in part is why we don't also have a Bill of Rights or something equivalent to that. But so much of the operations, the successful operations of this country and what's made it such a great country is the culturally infused dimensions of human rights and how much they go to the heart of who people are and their right to go about living their lives as they see fit. And everybody needs to understand that, let alone people who are born here as much as people who have arrived here.
The Attorney-General, Senator Brandis, has indicated that he has an appetite to look more critically at legislation that unnecessarily encroaches on traditional rights and freedoms. What does this mean and how do you see it playing out?
Well, the Attorney-General has directed the Australian Law Reform Commission to look at legislation and how they may impinge on traditional rights and freedoms and privileges. And I think the way it's going to be borne out is obviously the ALRC is going to do their report. Obviously, I am going to participate in their process. What I'm hoping, and I'm sure what the Attorney-General is hoping, is that it puts a renewed focus back on the importance of freedom as its own objective in of itself. Because freedom isn't just some word that we throw around when we want to talk about how much we value a free society. It goes back to the idea of the relationship between government, society and the individual, and the importance of the individual, whomever you are, to have inherent dignity about how you live your life. But that comes with burdens and responsibilities as well around a recognition of tolerance and acceptance of others, and tolerating behaviour sometimes that you don't even like, which is often difficult for people because we're never called in to defend basic freedoms when people are being polite and civil. Of course, it's only when people do things that we might perhaps not like to see or might see to be unreasonable. So it's to get the deference back into freedom. I think the other part of it that's going to come out is whether a lot of the time society's problems that we're seeking to fit can be solved through law rather than other avenues to achieve addressing issues through law. Because too often these days we've looked at problems in society and said the best solution is to create a new law and be very prescriptive, rather than saying, taking a step back and saying, we recognise there's a problem. Are there other ways to achieve it which preserve people's freedom more, but also deliver an equivalent outcome or improve society in the process, and recognise the component of that which is also about individual and societal responsibility?
So you're saying there's a nexus between the traditional conventions of freedom and liberty, human rights, and what has followed down the centuries in terms of legislated freedoms and rights and so on?
There's a clear connection between the foundations and intellectual foundations, I guess you'd say, of our modern society and how that has gone all the way back hundreds of years ago to the Enlightenment and to Magna Carta and so many other key events. And this is where my criticism is a lack of connection back to those values, and that those values were there for a reason and that they're very important because of how it frames government. Is government designed to be a framework to preserve and protect our liberty so that we can go off and live our lives and seek our own opportunity and prosperity and all of the things that we like and enjoy? Or is the job of government, and this is at the other end of the extreme, to use the powers of government to sort of move us around like we're pieces on a chessboard in the hope that we can achieve a greater equilibrium in society? And the point about taking a position in favour of more freedom is that we all want to seek greater social justice. The question is how you do it. And in favour of freedom and a freer society, you create a legal framework, but then you address a lot of the other issues not through law, but through cultural standards and norms that recognise issues of injustice.
So one issue that has caused debate in the humanitarian sector is the current and previous federal government's handling of the asylum seeker question. Australia is a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention. Do you see a conflict between Australia's status as a signatory and the policies of successive governments which have been, by some quarters deemed harsh?
I see an inconsistency, particularly with our aspirations for human rights and how we've been treating asylum seekers who have come to this country via boat. Well, we do have a situation where there is arbitrary detention. Currently and in the past, there's also issues around security assessments and the time that people are being detained, and that we need to recognise that that is an unacceptable way to treat people who are arriving to this country. But I'm being quite candid about asylum seekers. Like everybody else, you can have your own position, but what I have concluded is that this is not an easy problem to solve. And I say a problem to solve because people have their own metrics about what is the best outcome, whether we just open the floodgates and let asylum seekers in all the way to not letting anybody in. My view has always been that we have to show a humanitarian approach to enabling asylum seekers to come to this country. But equally, we have the challenge of not turning a blind eye to those people who are in refugee camps, who are in their own form of involuntary detention, waiting and seeking for a better life. And they need to be recognised and respected in the way we process asylum seekers in Australia as well.
The repeal of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which makes it a crime for someone to...
And it's not actually a crime, it's an offence.
An offence, sorry. Which makes it an offence for someone to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person on the grounds of race, has also been hotly debated. What's your position on this, and is there a solution that ensures vulnerable people or groups are protected from intimidation or vilification?
Well, my philosophical position is that I don't agree with the existence of the provision. But there are a lot of people who obviously disagree with me on that, and I'm not oblivious to that. And I don't in any way, in saying that, discount genuine concern within the community about degrees of racism. And one of the things I'm very strong on is even if we don't use the law to tackle racism, there are so many other ways that we should be tackling it parallel, even with the existence of the law. But I'm a pragmatic person and I recognise there's a law that's been in operation, but there are genuine issues with it about how it operates and issues around whether the bar is set too low in terms of what speech can invoke an offence. Similarly, there are issues around the way the test is applied, around whether it's a person from the community who's being offended, that's the assessments against, versus someone who's an average member of the Australian community. And that raises very serious issues in terms of equality before the law from a human rights approach as well. So like everybody else, I've seen the proposal that's been put on the table now by the Attorney-General. I think it has strengths. I'm quite open about that. But at the same time, I'm very engaged and interested in the views of people who have differences of opinion and how it can be curbed and moderated to recognise the genuine concerns that are out there in the community. And I think the most important thing is that people actively participate in that discussion. But what they shouldn't be doing in the process is fanning fear and promotion of the idea that in any way racism is acceptable. It is not acceptable. And this is a debate about the legal limits of free speech, not the acceptability of racism. And of course, not all things that are undesirable or unacceptable are unlawful. Even under the current Act, you have a right to say racist things in private. We'd all like to get rid of racism, but the law cannot solve all of society's ills, and that is what this whole process is demonstrating, and it's important to have a reasoned discussion.
Smoking causes thousands of deaths every year and costs the public purse a large amount of money, yet you opposed plain packaging of cigarettes. Similarly, you oppose Queensland's anti-biking laws, which purport to be in the interests of, stopping crime and violence and so on. Mm-hmm. Is there a point where collective rights outweigh the rights of the individual?
I am an individual rights guy, and I make no apologies for it, because everybody is an individual, not everybody is part of different collectives. And it comes back to the idea of what is the role of government. If you start creating group rights or group identity rights, what that in the end means is you're creating an environment where one group can be put at odds with another group, and people can get preference at the expense of other people, and it makes a mockery of the idea of universal human rights. So I'm an individual rights guy. But that doesn't mean that there aren't societal challenges that we need to address through law and fix through law. But we also have to have respect for individuals. And we have to respect the fact that even when people have choices, they make bad choices sometimes, and they need to be responded to. So if you take plain packaging, I am not against, for instance, certain measures around warning labels on tobacco products, because it clearly sends a message and addresses an issue of imbalance. But there are serious issues around speech, free speech, around private property, around taking away the intellectual property rights of companies, which I make no apology about. I strongly oppose those things, because once the precedent happens over here, it gets replicated, and we know that full well. People are now talking about it for alcohol. They're talking about it for fast food. And if people want to live in a society where the government controls every part of our lives and thinks it can come up with plainer answers and anaesthetise us all to the realities of life, that will not be making greater and bigger citizens. I'm a big fan of the Mark Stein quote, "The big government means small citizens." I want big citizens, not small citizens. That is what is in the best interest of this country, when we have 22 million people with the unleashed potential rather than the power unleashed of 160,000 bureaucrats in places like Canberra.
You spoke earlier about being gay. Is there a human rights dimension to the debate around same-sex marriage?
There is a human rights dimension to debate around same-sex marriage, or marriage for same-sex couples. We're not talking about creating a new institution. We're talking about an existing institution where we allow loving same-sex couples to enter into it. But marriage is a civil right. It's not a human right. But there is an issue around human rights around equality before the law. So there is a dimension of it, but it's not the sole component of it. But my beef with a lot of the discussion around marriage for same-sex couples is just looking nuanced at whether we should change the existing Marriage Act without actually looking and going back to that question again, and some things can't all be solved through law, is why does the government endorse marriage in the first place? It has enormous social benefits. I'm a big fan of marriage. I'm engaged myself. But it has enormous social benefits. But is the best way to deal with it through government? Or should what government be doing is establishing some sort of civil contract which people can enter into, and then religious faiths actually take control of marriage, and then we resolve a lot of the religious objections. That's how it operates in France, for instance. It's not necessarily the solution everybody will agree with, but sometimes rather than just saying, here are the parameters of debate and let's solve the problem here, we need to look back at the broader issue and see whether we can find a solution that can meet everybody's objectives.
Just finally, you reportedly have a life-size portrait of Ronald Reagan in your home. Can you tell us who your philosophical and political heroes are? Notwithstanding Ronald Reagan.
Well, what I love about Reagan, and I need to make it clear, the reason the picture is, it's a beautiful photograph. It was on the front page of March 1985 Vanity Fair, and it is in itself its own work of art. And I'm very fortunate to have purchased one. It was kind of a 30th birthday present to myself. But it's actually in the bedroom. I know some people might find that a bit weird. It's because it was the only wall it fits on, because it's quite large. It's not quite life-size, but it's large. I won't dispute that. But what I love about Reagan is his capacity to communicate, the fact that he never felt he was better than other people, that he did things with good humour and a smile, and so it's for his communications capacity. And when you're talking about important issues, whether it be ending the Cold War to tax policy, you need to be able to relate to people, you need to be friendly, and people have to see a sense of sincerity, and I liked his sense of clarity. Obviously, I also agree with many things, but I love that charm and that dimension to him as well. But there are other people who do that in the economic space, like Milton Friedman. But I would always consider myself somebody who is a product of different thinking and different ideas at times, from life experience all the way to intellectual heroes. And so one of the greatest forces and contribution to my life is my late grandfather, who was somebody who recognised that he was in a position of good standing in the community, but saw very much that his responsibility was to give back to others and to go beyond himself to improve society. And that has always had a very important impact in the way I've seen myself and how I feel I have a responsibility to engage and to act in a sort of leadership role to improve society. Now, not everyone will always agree with what I say, and I'm not immune to that. But nobody should be in doubt about the motivation, and that I do want to improve society for a much better, much more harmonious and much more prosperous Australia. So equally, my mother has been a huge influence on me. She's one of the hardest working people that I know and probably will ever meet. And she has been an enormous influence in my work ethic and attitude. So are there intellectual heroes? Yes, and I can list them off forever, but sometimes it's about the people who are closer in your life that have a much bigger impact in shaping your values and how you see the world, and then go on to make a contribution.
Tim Wilson, thanks for your time today.
A pleasure.